So first of all, could you clear something up once and for all? Is it Housemarque or Housemarque, or is it something entirely different?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's Housemarque. I suppose it doesn't come across, and there's a lot of different interpretations. But yeah, Housemarque, and it does come from the previous two companies, which were Bloodhouse and Terramark. So combination hybrid of the previous companies from 95.
Yeah. And since the release of Returnal, Housemarque has been bought by Sony. What was the thought process behind the decision to sell?
I have no idea. No, it's so. I mean, as you know, we've been making a lot of Sony exclusive titles in the last 14 years or so, since Super Stardust HD on the PlayStation 3. So it's been a long sort of a relationship, and I think this was a wonderful culmination that we're all mutually working towards. But being able to have something like Returnal, which is a huge transition title for us, as the culmination piece prior to this unison, I think is just a good way to celebrate this cooperation of so many years.
Would you say that that Housemarque was already on this path to taking like the next step before the decision to sell, or has this changed the company in major ways?
I don't think anything's changed really. We're still making exactly the same type of games, albeit now with a slightly larger scope. So we're kind of growing into the Housemarque DNA a bit more, and we're able to transfer a lot of the learnings and the essence of who we hope to be into bigger titles. But I think it's everything is just about allowing us to tell exactly the type of stories and have exactly the kind of gameplay that we always wanted to have, but now with a bit more flexibility and room to grow.
Yeah, and at first glance, a game like Returnal, it could be seen as a bold new direction for Housemarque, especially in terms of scale and scope. But there's definitely a red thread going from Stardust through Dead Nation, Resogun, Alienation, Next Machina, and Matterfall, all the way to Returnal. Not only in gameplay, but also in terms of self-awareness and artistic integrity. It's sort of like getting a string of great, exciting albums from a cool indie band you really like. Is this self-awareness something that you're consciously and constantly working on, or is it just, there as an integrated part of the company?
It's a good question because, as humans, we are not always too self-aware of a lot of the values that we hold, but we try to reflect on them sometimes, and, bringing up, topics like, why do we make games? What's our purpose? These things really help narrow the road in front of us. And I think in general, just the appreciation for games as an art form, with the legacy of us being very gameplay centric, it sort of carries over to how we think and how we like to design systems and games. And one of the newer sort of expansions with Returnal is the narrative side of things. And even with that, we wanted it to accompany the tight gameplay. And with that, we also had some room to experiment with it. So we rarely take solutions as they are, but we kind of like to pass a lot of ideas and conventions through this Housemarque filter, and then rework things usually from the ground up. But I think that the internal vision of really perfecting different types of games or different types of subsystems is something that we really take pride in, and it's quite central to how we think about the creation process in general.
And also, Housemarque is Finland's oldest video game developer.
Yes.
I'm wondering, how do you find the enthusiasm and the inspiration to create something like Returnal after close to 30 years?
This again, very good question. with that legacy comes a lot of history, and there's a lot of different generations that are in the company and can kind of work their own magic into it. So it's a culmination of generations, but historically the demo scene, which is the technologist hobby scene with early home computers and Amigas and such, I think that really translates to the kind of hacker tech sensibility of what can we do, what is not generally just allowed, but how can we break the system to allow it to do cooler things. And then how do we translate that heritage to future types of experiences? And so it's not just the people who started the company, even though they're still majority of them still within the company. It's how people like myself who were changed by the early games of Housemarque can then come into Housemarque and kind of continue the same, but also put our twist on it as well at the same time.
And speaking of the Finnish gaming industry, I mean, this might be a bit far-fetched. I don't know that much about the Finnish gaming industry, but I find it interesting that two of the most exciting and bold games from recent years have been from Finland. Were you inspired by and emboldened by Remedy's artistic and commercial success with Control, building up to the launch of Returnal?
It's funny because Remedy, being a company also funded in '95, 2 months younger than the fusion of Housemarque, has still always in history been sort of the big brother in terms of coming up with huge IPs, and they having a very distinctive style of marrying that cinematic and film-like experience. So I think early on and all the time it's been like a good North Star in terms of this AAA experience. But like mentioned, we like to do things our way, and even with just our approach to the narrative side of things, it's quite unique and quite different. But then there's a lot of these Nordic sensibilities, like the melancholy and the darkness and kind of going against the odds and living through frustration that hit similar notes across some of these Finnish games. So even though it's not been a direct reference or that, I think we do share a lot of similar ways of thinking. And of course, there are some key personnel who have worked on not only both companies, but both projects. So I think there's a distinct difference of direction though as well. But I'm glad that we were able to reach this high plateau, because it's a very complimentary thing to say that these are indeed games that stand out in the bigger picture of games that come out in a certain period of time.
Yeah, certainly, and this leads us to Returnal, and it's been a few months now. What are your thoughts on the reception of Returnal now that you've had the time to process? What would you say are the main things that you take away from the feedback on Returnal?
It's one of those roller coaster experiences where you really you take it in and subconsciously you try to make sense of it, and it's quite an overwhelming thing to receive. I think for everybody it's powerful and a lot of positive feelings, especially with the remote working. It helps to see that fans are taken into it and they really appreciate the work that we were able to do, even socially distancing as we have. So being this big of a game for a team, that's still quite small, it's a huge accomplishment. Secondarily, it's good to see that a lot of those values that we've really worked on for years in the past are actually making it to this new types of games. So I think a lot of people may take things for granted when they say, oh, it's definitely a Housemarque game. But for us, that's just saying that we did a very good job with picking and choosing the elements and how do we combine those into this new type of experience. And of course, there's always things that are missing or could be different. But again, we embrace a lot of that as well, because we know that having a journey like a journey that Celine is having, you know, putting the player into that same mindset and being a part of those struggles is quite a difficult job to accomplish. So I think some of those frustrations and negative feelings are also ingrained into the experience in a way. So it's a lot of different emotions, and I think we're just getting a lot of learnings from it as well.
Speaking of which, talking about the story and the narrative in Returnal, Harry Kruger, which is of course the main guy behind the story here, he has stated that the story in Returnal is intentionally ambiguous and open to interpretation. My Returnal story is that Celine is a fictional character in the mind of Thea, and that the events on the fictional planet of Atropos is about processing and coming to terms with the loss of Thea's child, Helios. What's your Returnal story?
Well, let's just say this, that first of all, it's wonderful that you have your own Returnal story, because I think this is exactly what Harry and everybody on the narrative team wanted to kind of have players experience, right? I love the ambiguity of the title in itself, that finding out new things may actually switch my story from, you know, I'm very clear about certain things and how things are interacting and why, and then finding even a single thing in a room somewhere may switch totally to like, well, this negates everything I thought was true, right? And this plays around with that cosmic horror theme of what is reality? Are we defining it, or are we just a puppet that's being played in this grand stage? So my story actually is this. I learned about this open-endedness from Harry 4 or 5 years ago, when he was just inking up the general concept. And because I saw this possibility of it, and knowing that I'm very close to the development team, that I could get spoiled quite easily of the different options and everything, I told then to Harry that please don't tell me about any of the options, or if one of them's more true or anything like that. And I wanted to play the game and experience it for myself. So actually I had a sort of a fresh take when I got in, and I'm still working on my interpretations, but yeah, it's a wonderful way to look at storytelling. You know, can we create options that players can then devise into their own way of interpreting things?
It seems like your experience with the story is very similar to mine. I have like 150 hours with the game. I've got the platinum trophy, and I'm still only about like 60% sure that my theory is correct. So I'm just wondering, is there actually one of the stories here that is considered canon?
Well, this is the beautiful thing, that because I restricted myself from that vault of knowledge, I wouldn't even be able to tell you that, because I don't know that. And I think that's the relatability about the IP itself, is that it has this open-endedness, and you know, it kind of transcends storytelling in a way that whatever we do with the IP, as long as it retains this question mark, this mystery, it can basically do anything, because it's not restricted to being just this. You know, if at some point somebody says, oh, Atropos is this or Atropos isn't this, then the IP essentially becomes that, right? While as long as we don't think about it, it can go anywhere.
I have a friend though, let's call him Nick,
Yeah.
which is really upset about not getting concrete answers from the story. Do you understand that frustration?
Absolutely, absolutely. But again, it's not that there's a designed frustration within the game, but we give the players a journey to go on, right? And a lot of that is learning things the hard way. And when you start the journey with Celine, she is against all these obstacles, and that's the story is overcoming negative situations, and feeling the power that comes across when you triumph, right? And even putting these pieces together, giving a conclusion would negate a lot of the things that we intend to do with this title. So I hope I don't have any good concrete answers for Nick, but it's a part of our intentions to take people on a journey and also empower them to feel things that they maybe aren't feeling with other types of experiences.
What you're saying about overcoming great odds is there's a specific point in the game, which is Echoing Ruins, the fourth biome. By this time, I mean, you've mastered the game to some extent. You feel that this is something you can actually complete. And the plot has thickened. And then you're greeted with the bars for music that seems, oddly familiar. And climbing that tower, with the music building and finally facing Hyperion, is the favorite moment from Returnal with many players, including myself. And I'm wondering, what is the defining Returnal moment for you personally and for Housemarque generally?
Again, the beauty of the experience, I can only talk about my personal experience, and that is exactly, like you mentioned, that's a good highlight for you and for a lot of players, the fourth biome, and part of the story is how you got there, right? You had to overcome the initial story arc, which is, for me, actually one of the more powerful moments when I was defeating Nemesis, the previous boss, because it was sort of the culmination of that struggle. And it does exactly what we hope that people go through, this emotional triumph, and then realizing that there is a lot more still to uncover. And then Hyperion is sort of the very personal part of the journey, and I think that's why it resonates so much with a lot of players. And it's of course built, the atmosphere is built quite well, so I can see that as well. But yeah, I think I was having a lot of frustrations in the first half, if you will.
Yeah, same here.
So Nemesis for me personally was the biggest triumph, but Hyperion is a good second.
Nemesis was the first boss I actually took on the first try, so that was a great experience as well.
There you go.
But I have to ask this: did someone get fired for creating the drones in the derelict city?
No. The drones are, but again, the drones are very much part of the, we like to think of Returnal as the experience that we were able to package, but then like a lot of the thinking and stories go beyond the game, right? So if you go look on the forums and the conversations, the drones are very much a part of that conversation. And then I like to say that, a lot of these players are also expressing this frustration of Celine on the forum, saying, oh, this is very difficult. And then other Celines that are more experienced come in and help them out and convince them that it's doable. And I just really like the conversation that it evokes. But yeah, clearly there's certain points of frustration that can be pinpointed down to a single word like drones. That I think is very expressive of what Returnal does to the ego of a player.
And the meta idea of other players being other versions of Celine is also interesting, because the way that the story is built in the game could also be seen as, a parallel to the process of actually creating the game, with all the books that you find and research that has been done in this house. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And that's also, when you look at the house sequences, it's deliberately taking the player to a different space, different mentality, different mindset. And also with the first person view, literally being like Celine or being like one of us, the developers, in an environment where you're surrounded by things of interest, but kind of like having to connect the dots, if you will. So even there, even though the pacing is quite different from the main game, we don't want to rush things. We want the player to still be in control, kind of exploring at their own pace. But yeah, it's an experimentation in sort of seeing how players react to it, and I think that's one of the wonderful things that video games allows us to do is, we can set the pacing, but we can't make the player do stuff. The player is allowed to do things at their own pace.
An early feedback on Returnal was criticism on the lack of save points. And I remember statements from Housemarque that you were looking into perhaps implementing some sort of save system to protect players from losing great runs. What's your stand on this now, a few months later?
So again, there's always things to improve on. Like, we've been updating the game with a lot of patches that help with the stability and everything. And I think that we're in a good place with that now. With the save system, of course, save and resume, other ways of looking at continuing runs. I think it's clear that Returnal was designed to keep the player on the knife's edge. The idea of not having a safety net is really that you can't really take comfort in places where you're not given comfort, right? And then you die, and then you're at the ship, which is your home, your comfort. But again, ready to go on other journey, maybe choosing differently this time. So I think that's ingrained into the design of what Returnal is. So the fundamental Returnal experience is the one we delivered on, of course, minus some of the stability issues. That being said, we're very much open to being able to give players slight adjustments and options in the future. So I think that's what we're looking at. So we're not trying to water down the experience that we intended to have, but we do understand that there are some ways that some players want to adjust the intended experience. So hopefully we'll have some things to talk about soon.
I guess the main issue here is probably, veteran players who have mastered the game to some extent. I mean, you can have runs for like 3 or 4 hours, and then the game crashes and it's all lost.
Exactly, and this is the thing that we didn't intend to have, of course, and we're working on as we have to make sure that, like, crashes, for example, are minimized and not a part of the equation. So, but back to the way the game was intended to play, it was intended to have this approach of a bit of a brutalistic mindset, and for a lot of people, it was a part of the challenge to overcome as well. So it works on quite many different levels.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, I think that save points would have lessened the experience, at least on the first playthrough of the game, for me personally. So I'm okay with it. I mean, there's a lot of people asking about or talking about or hoping for more content from the Returnal universe. Can you say anything about your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, like mentioned just a while back, again, it goes into the ambiguity of the IP itself. We want to look at it as a universe of options, possibilities. And in a way, there are certain things that we want to deliver on, but again, we don't want to push too much through before it's available. So in the end, it's definitely a universe with possibilities that we're open to delivering in the future. Not setting things in stone and keeping our options open is a good roadmap for the future.
Yeah, of course, you haven't announced anything new yet, but is the launch of Returnal, an indication of what one can expect from Housemarque in the future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly our catalog is built on perfecting certain formulas, transitioning to now the sort of bigger scope of things, and it's one thing to trying to reinvent the wheel, but it's also one thing of sort of learning and building a foundation that has long-term possibilities. So I think we're very much maturing as a 26-year-old company now, and starting to come into our stride. And hopefully we can always surprise people. It's good to have that momentum and things that you can deliver on, but then you always need to look at it from perspective of what's new as well. What can be the fresh, exciting part on top of the very, very good gameplay and everything else.
Well, speaking as a huge fan of Returnal, I love that game. It's my favorite game this year. I'm really excited to see what's next. So thanks a lot for taking the time to talk with me.
Absolutely, and wonderful to hear that. And again, this is the best kind of feedback to us and the team, because we took risks, and it's good to see that some of them are paying off. Thank you.
The deepest of the deep.